They said he was crazy for buying a crumbling cabin in a dead canyon for the price of a used lawnmower, but when the floor gave way one stormy night, what Mason Carter found carved into the rock 3 stories below would silence every laugh, rewrite his destiny, and prove that sometimes the biggest fortunes hide in the places everyone else is too afraid to look. Before we explore the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The desert wind carried more than dust through Copper Ridge that September morning. It carried whispers, judgments, and the kind of small-town gossip that stuck to a man like oil to an engine block. Mason Carter stood in the parking lot of Henderson's Hardware, loading 2x4s into his beat-up Ford F-150, trying to ignore the stares burning into his back. He was 34 years old, broke, divorced, and about to make what everyone in town called the dumbest decision of his life. "Heard you bought the Redstone place," came a voice from behind him. Mason turned to see Dale Simmons, owner of the local diner, arms crossed, expression somewhere between pity and amusement. "That old canyon cabin?" Mason nodded, securing the lumber with a frayed bungee cord. "Closed on it yesterday." Dale let out a low whistle. "Son, people have been trying to unload that property for 40 years. There's a reason it's sold for $900. $950, Mason corrected, a slight smile tugging at his lips despite everything. "Whatever you paid, it was too much." Dale shook his head. "That place has been sitting empty since 1987. Before that, old Raymond Blackwell lived there for 30 years without electricity or running water. Died alone up there. They found him 3 weeks later." Mason lifted another board. "I know the history." "Do you know about the 3 families who tried to flip it?" Dale continued. "All of them gave up within a month. Said the place was cursed. Foundations cracked, roofs half gone, and there's no road access for the last 2 miles. You'll be hauling everything in on foot." "I've got a dolly," Mason said simply. Dale studied him for a long moment. "Look, I get it. You've had a rough year. Divorce, losing the business, your truck getting repossessed, but throwing away your last $1,000 on a death trap in the middle of nowhere." He paused. "That's not a fresh start, Mason. That's giving up." Mason slammed the tailgate shut, harder than necessary. "Appreciate the concern, Dale, but I've made my decision." As he climbed into the truck, he caught sight of his reflection in the side mirror. Weathered face, 3-day stubble, eyes that had seen too many broken promises. Dale wasn't wrong about the rough year. His construction business had collapsed after his partner ran off with their equipment and half their clients. His wife had left 6 months later, taking their savings and the house they'd built together with their own hands. Now he was living in a rented room above the hardware store, watching his bank account drain like water through cupped fingers. The cabin had appeared in a county auction listing 3 weeks ago. Abandoned property, sold as is, minimum bid $500. Mason had driven out to see it on a Tuesday, hiking the last 2 miles through scrub brush and red rock. What he found was exactly what everyone said it would be, a disaster. Single-story structure built sometime in the 1950s, walls constructed from local stone, roof made of corrugated metal that had rusted through in a dozen places. Windows broken, door hanging crooked, porch sagging like a broken promise. But Mason had seen something else too. He'd seen how the walls were still standing after 40 years of abandonment. How the stonework, though weathered, showed craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore. How the cabin sat on a natural shelf of rock overlooking a canyon so beautiful it made his chest ache. And most importantly, he'd seen an opportunity everyone else had missed because they were too busy laughing. The drive out of town took 20 minutes on paved roads, then another 30 on dirt tracks that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. Mason's truck bounced over rocks and through dry creek beds, engine groaning in protest. Finally, the road ended at a weathered wooden post with a faded sign, Redstone Canyon, private property, no trespassing. Mason parked and began unloading. 2 trips for the lumber, 1 for his tools, another for the camping gear and supplies he'd need for the next few weeks. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as he hauled everything along the narrow path that led into the canyon. Sweat soaked through his shirt. His shoulders ached from the weight of the wood. But with each step, something inside him shifted. Out here, there was no one watching, no one judging, no one telling him what a fool he was. The cabin came into view as he rounded a bend in the trail. It looked even worse than he remembered. The metal roof had partially collapsed on the far side. The stone walls were streaked with water damage. Weeds had grown up through cracks in the foundation. But the bones were good. Mason could see that. He'd been in construction for 15 years, and he knew the difference between cosmetic damage and structural failure. He dropped his load on the porch, which creaked ominously but held. The front door resisted at first, swollen from years of weather, then gave way with a groan that echoed through the empty canyon. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the musty smell of abandonment. A single large room dominated the space, with what looked like a kitchen area on one side and a stone fireplace on the other. 2 doors led to smaller rooms in the back. Mason walked through slowly, his contractor's eye cataloguing everything. Floorboards worn but solid. Walls intact except for water damage near the collapsed roof section. Fireplace in working condition. The kitchen sink was rusted through, but the hand pump beside it looked functional. He gave it a few experimental cranks, and after a moment, brownish water sputtered out. "Well, that's something," he muttered to himself. He spent the rest of the afternoon making the place habitable enough for one night. He cleared debris from the main room, swept decades of dust and leaves out the door, and set up his camping cot near the fireplace. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and gold, he built a small fire and heated a can of beans on a portable stove. Sitting on the porch as darkness fell, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in months: peace. The canyon was silent except for the occasional call of a night bird and the whisper of wind through the rocks. Above him, stars began to appear, more than he'd ever seen from town. No streetlights, no headlights, no glow of civilization. Just darkness and stars and the weight of everything he'd lost, lifting slightly from his shoulders. He was about to head inside when he noticed something odd. From his position on the porch, he could see the canyon wall directly across from the cabin, maybe 200 feet away. In the fading light, he'd assumed it was just natural rock formation. But now, with darkness settling in and his fire casting flickering shadows, he could make out something that didn't look quite natural. Regular patterns in the stone, lines too straight to be coincidental. Mason squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but the light was failing too quickly. He made a mental note to investigate in the morning, then headed inside and secured the door as best he could with a piece of lumber wedged against it. Sleep came hard that first night. The cabin groaned and settled around him, wood and stone adjusting to the temperature change. Sometime around midnight, he was jolted awake by a sound he couldn't immediately identify. Not threatening exactly, but wrong somehow. He lay perfectly still, listening. There it was again. A low rumble, like distant thunder, except the sky had been clear when he'd gone to sleep. He grabbed his flashlight and checked the windows. Nothing but darkness and stars. The sound came again, and this time he felt it as much as heard it. A vibration through the floorboards, so subtle he might have imagined it. Then silence. Mason sat on the edge of his cot for another 20 minutes, listening, but the sound didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion pulled him back down, and he drifted into uneasy sleep. Morning came with harsh sunlight streaming through the broken windows. Mason woke stiff and sore from the cot, but his mind was clear. Coffee first, then work. He got the portable stove going and brewed a pot using bottled water, then stood on the porch watching the canyon wake up around him. In daylight, the place looked different, less threatening, more honest about its decay, but also full of potential. The view alone was worth more than the $950 he'd paid. The canyon stretched out before him, layers of red and orange rock carved by wind and water over millennia. A person could spend a lifetime out here and never see another soul if they didn't want to. He was halfway through his second cup of coffee when he remembered the strange patterns he'd noticed on the canyon wall the night before. Setting down his mug, he walked to the edge of the porch and looked across. In full sunlight, what he saw made him pause. The rock face across from the cabin definitely showed signs of human modification. Not obvious, not unless you were looking for it, but there. Straight lines carved into the stone. What might have been the remains of old wooden beams jutting from cracks in the rock. And near the base, partially hidden by brush, what looked like the entrance to something. Mason's pulse quickened. An old mine shaft, maybe. The area had been heavily mined in the 1800s and early 1900s, but the maps he'd seen at the county assessor's office hadn't shown any mining claims on this particular property. He finished his coffee and spent the morning doing essential repairs. First priority was securing the roof before the next rain. He climbed up carefully, testing every step, and found the damage was worse than it looked from the ground. Entire sections of corrugated metal had rusted through or blown away, but the underlying support beams were mostly sound. By noon, he'd managed to patch the worst areas with his new lumber and some salvaged metal panels. It wasn't pretty, but it would keep the weather out. He was securing the last piece when he heard an engine in the distance. Mason climbed down and watched as a dusty jeep bumped along the trail toward the cabin. The vehicle stopped about 50 feet away, and a woman climbed out. She was probably in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a braid, and the kind of weathered face that came from a lifetime in the sun. She wore practical jeans and a faded denim shirt, and she approached with the confidence of someone who belonged here. "You must be the fool who bought the Redstone place," she called out, but there was no mockery in her voice, just statement of fact. Mason climbed off the roof. "Mason Carter, and yeah, guilty as charged." She studied him for a moment, then stuck out her hand. "Iris Whitman. I run the Whitman Ranch about 5 miles west of here. Wanted to come introduce myself before you heard about me through town gossip." Her grip was firm, calloused. Mason liked her immediately. "Appreciate that. Can I offer you some coffee? It's camp coffee, but it's hot." "Best kind," she said, following him to the porch. They sat in the shade and Mason poured her a cup from his dented pot. Iris sipped it and nodded approval. "So what brings a contractor to this particular piece of nowhere?" "Long story. I've got time." So Mason told her, not everything, but enough. The failed business, the divorce, the feeling of needing to start completely over somewhere no one knew him. Somewhere he could work with his hands and not think too hard about the last year of his life. Iris listened without interruption, then set down her empty cup. "Town thinks you're crazy." "I know. They're probably right." She paused. "But there are different kinds of crazy. The kind where you've given up and the kind where you're refusing to. You strike me as the second type." "Hope you're right." She stood, brushing dust from her jeans. "Look, I'll be straight with you. This canyon has a reputation. People say it's cursed, that Raymond Blackwell went mad out here, that the place itself is wrong somehow. Personally, I think that's garbage. But I've lived in these parts for 43 years, and I've learned that sometimes places keep secrets for good reasons." Mason felt a chill despite the heat. "What kind of secrets?" "The kind that make men like Raymond Blackwell live alone in the wilderness for 30 years. She walked toward her jeep, then turned back. "You need anything, medical emergency, supplies, whatever, you come find me. Whitman Ranch. Anyone can point you there." "Why are you helping me?" Mason asked. "You don't know me." Iris smiled, the first real smile he'd seen since arriving in Copper Ridge. "Because 43 years ago I moved out here alone to start a cattle ranch. Everyone said I was crazy too. That a woman couldn't make it in this country. That I'd be broke or dead within a year." She climbed into her jeep. "Turns out the people who call you crazy are usually the ones too scared to try anything themselves." Mason watched her drive away, dust plume trailing behind the jeep until it disappeared around a bend. Then he turned back to the cabin, seeing it with fresh eyes. What secrets had Raymond Blackwell been keeping? And why had he chosen this specific spot, this specific cabin, to hide away from the world. He spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the immediate area around the property. The cabin sat on a natural shelf of rock about 20 feet above the canyon floor. Behind it, the cliff face rose another 100 feet, sheer and unclimbable. In front, the land dropped away in layers of sedimentary stone, each stratum telling a story millions of years old. But it was the canyon wall across from the cabin that kept drawing his attention. Those straight lines, those regular patterns. The more he looked, the more convinced he became that someone had done significant work over there, and recently too. Some of the brush near the base looked deliberately placed, not naturally grown. As the sun began to set, Mason made a decision. Tomorrow, he'd cross the canyon floor and investigate. Whatever was over there, hidden or not, he needed to know. This was his property now, all 12 acres of it, and he wasn't going to ignore mysterious modifications just because the locals whispered about curses. That night, he lay on his cot, listening to the canyon settle into darkness. The rumbling sound didn't return, but he found himself straining to hear it anyway. Around midnight, just as he was drifting off, he heard something else. Footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate, definitely human. Mason's heart hammered as he reached for the flashlight beside his cot. He grabbed the hammer he'd been using for repairs and moved silently toward the door. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth. Then they stopped, right in front of the door. He waited, hammer raised, barely breathing. A long moment of silence. Then a voice, old and raspy, spoke through the wood. "You found it yet?" Mason's blood turned cold. "Who's there?" No response. Just the sound of footsteps retreating, growing fainter, then disappearing entirely. He yanked the door open and swept his flashlight across the porch. Empty. He checked the perimeter of the cabin, shining his light into every shadow. Nothing. No one. But in the dust on the porch, clear as day in his flashlight beam, were footprints. Bootprints, large, definitely fresh. They led from the steps to the door, then away again, disappearing at the edge of the porch where the rock took over. Mason stood there for a long time, hammer still clenched in his fist, pulse racing. Someone had been here. Someone real, not a ghost or hallucination. Someone who knew about this place. Someone who asked if he'd found it yet. Found what? He went back inside and wedged the lumber against the door again, but sleep was impossible now. He sat by the dying fire, watching shadows dance on the stone walls, and tried to make sense of everything. The modified canyon wall, the rumbling sounds, the mysterious visitor, the town's warnings about the place being cursed. As dawn broke, painting the canyon in shades of gold and crimson, Mason made his decision. He wasn't leaving. He wasn't scared away by midnight visitors or strange sounds or small-town superstition. Whatever was happening here, whatever secret this place held, he was going to figure it out. He made coffee as the sun climbed higher, then gathered his tools. Today he'd cross the canyon and investigate that rock wall. Today he'd start finding answers. Because Mason Carter had learned something important over the past year of loss and struggle. Sometimes the only way forward was straight through the fear. The canyon floor was harder to navigate than it looked from above. What appeared to be smooth stone from the cabin was actually a jumble of rocks, crevices, and unexpected drops. Mason picked his way across carefully, testing each foothold, very aware that a twisted ankle out here could be fatal. No cell signal, no neighbors, no way to call for help. 20 minutes of careful climbing brought him to the base of the far wall. Up close, the modifications were undeniable. Someone had carved channels into the rock, probably for water runoff. Someone had drilled holes for support beams, most of which had long since rotted away. And someone had definitely built something here, something that connected to the natural cave system that honeycombed these canyons. The entrance was partially hidden by carefully arranged stones and overgrown brush, but Mason found it. A gap in the rock face, maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. Beyond it, darkness. He pulled out his flashlight and crouched down, shining the beam inside. The passage extended back about 15 feet, then opened into what looked like a larger space. The walls were natural stone, worn smooth by ancient water, but the floor had been leveled and cleared of debris. Mason hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him not to go in there alone, without telling anyone where he was. But curiosity and something deeper, something that felt like destiny, pulled him forward. He crawled through the entrance and stood up in the chamber beyond. His flashlight beam swept across a space about the size of a small bedroom. Natural cave, but definitely modified. The walls showed tool marks where someone had widened the passage. The ceiling had been reinforced with old timber beams, blackened with age but still solid. And on the far wall, carved deep into the stone, were words. Raymond Blackwell, 1957. Let them laugh, I found it. Mason's hands shook as he traced the letters with his fingertips. 1957. The same year the county records showed Raymond Blackwell had purchased the cabin property. He'd found something important enough to carve his discovery into solid rock, something that made him willing to live alone in the wilderness for 30 years. Below the inscription, an arrow pointed downward. Mason followed it with his flashlight and found what he'd somehow known would be there. Another passage, narrow and steep, descending into darkness. The entrance had been partially sealed with loose rocks, but recently disturbed. Some of the stones showed scrape marks, as if someone had moved them aside and then hastily replaced them. The midnight visitor. He'd been checking to see if Mason had found this place yet, which meant there were people who knew about whatever lay below. People who might not want an outsider discovering it. Mason checked his watch. Already past noon. He should go back to the cabin, think this through, maybe talk to Iris about what he'd found. The smart play was to be cautious, to plan properly before exploring further. But when had Mason ever done the smart thing? He began removing the rocks that blocked the passage, stacking them carefully to the side. The opening revealed was barely wide enough for his shoulders, more of a crack in the stone than a proper tunnel. But it was definitely man-made, or at least man-modified. Someone had worked hard to create a passage here. Mason squeezed through, moving sideways, his flashlight beam bouncing crazily off the walls. The passage curved and descended, tight enough that he had to turn his body at angles to fit through. Just when he was starting to panic, wondering if he'd gotten himself wedged into a position he couldn't escape from, the walls widened. He stumbled into another chamber, this one larger than the first, much larger. His flashlight beam couldn't reach the far walls. The air was cooler here, almost cold, and carried a mineral smell he couldn't quite identify. Copper maybe, or something richer. He swept the flashlight around, getting his bearings. The chamber was roughly circular, maybe 40 feet across. The walls glittered slightly in his beam, some mineral content catching the light. The floor was level, covered in fine dust that showed no footprints except the scuff marks from his own entrance. And in the center of the chamber, rising from the floor like an altar, was a formation of rock unlike anything Mason had ever seen. Geometric, almost crystalline, veins of something metallic running through it in patterns that looked too regular to be natural. He approached slowly, drawn by something he couldn't explain. The formation was roughly 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, shaped vaguely like a giant's tooth. As he got closer, his flashlight beam seemed to intensify, reflecting off the metallic veins until the entire chamber glowed with a soft, otherworldly light. Mason reached out to touch it, then stopped. Every instinct told him this was important. This was what Raymond Blackwell had found. This was what the midnight visitor was checking on. This was the secret the canyon had been keeping. But what exactly was it? He circled the formation, examining it from every angle. The metallic veins weren't just on the surface. They ran deep into the rock, disappearing into the floor and ceiling. The patterns they formed were hypnotic, almost mathematical in their precision. And when he put his hand close to the surface, not quite touching, he could feel something. Heat, energy, vibration. Mason jerked his hand back, heart pounding. This wasn't just an unusual rock formation. This was something else entirely. Something valuable, probably. Something worth hiding for decades. Something worth living alone in a canyon to protect. A sound echoed through the chamber. The same low rumble he'd heard his first night in the cabin, except now he was hearing it from the source. It seemed to emanate from the formation itself, or perhaps from something deeper, something this rock formation was connected to. The vibration traveled through the floor and up his legs, setting his teeth on edge. Then it stopped. Silence rushed back in, thick and complete. Mason stood there for a long moment, trying to steady his breathing, trying to process what he'd found. Tomorrow he'd come back with better lights, proper equipment, maybe even a camera. Tonight, he needed to get back to the cabin before dark, needed to think about what this meant. As he squeezed back through the narrow passage, climbing toward the upper chamber, his mind raced with possibilities. Mining rights, mineral claims, legal surveys. Whatever this was, it was on his property now. His $950 investment might have just turned into something extraordinary. He emerged from the cave into late afternoon sunlight that felt harsh after the darkness below. The hike back across the canyon floor took longer than he expected. His legs were shaky, whether from adrenaline or exertion he couldn't tell. When he finally hauled himself back up to the cabin shelf, the sun was already touching the horizon. Mason stood on his porch, looking back across the canyon at the hidden cave entrance, and felt something shift inside him. All the people who'd laughed at him for buying this place, all the warnings about curses and madness, they'd been wrong. Or maybe, just maybe, Raymond Blackwell had deliberately encouraged those stories to keep people away from what he'd discovered. Either way, Mason wasn't the fool everyone thought he was. Not anymore. That night, Mason barely slept. His mind kept returning to the glowing formation in the chamber below, to the metallic veins running through the rock like circuit boards in stone. He'd seen a lot of unusual geology in his years of construction, drilling foundations through layers of sediment and volcanic rock, but nothing like this. Nothing that hummed with that strange energy that made his skin prickle just from proximity. By first light, he was up and making coffee, planning his day with the methodical precision his father had taught him years ago. A contractor didn't just dive into a job. He surveyed, he measured, he understood what he was dealing with before making a single cut or drilling a single hole. The same principle applied here. He spent the morning searching the cabin more thoroughly than he had before. Raymond Blackwell had lived here for 30 years. Surely he'd left something behind, some record of what he'd found, some explanation for why he'd chosen this isolation. The main room yielded nothing but dust and mouse droppings. The two back rooms were equally bare, stripped clean long ago by whoever had handled the estate. But as Mason was running his hands along the stone walls, checking for loose rocks or hidden compartments, his fingers found something odd. Near the fireplace, one of the stones sat slightly proud of the others. Not much, maybe a quarter inch, but enough to catch his attention. He pressed it. Nothing. Pulled it. Nothing. Then, almost by accident, he twisted it clockwise. The stone rotated with a grinding sound, and something clicked deep in the wall. A section of the fireplace facing, 3 stones wide and 4 high, swung inward like a door. Behind it was a hollow space, and inside that space was a wooden box. Mason's hands trembled as he lifted it out. The box was about the size of a shoebox, made from cedar, surprisingly well preserved. It had a simple brass latch, but no lock. He carried it to the porch where the light was better and set it down on the weathered boards. For a moment, he just stared at it. Once he opened this, there was no going back. Whatever secrets Raymond Blackwell had kept would become his responsibility, his burden. The smart thing would be to call someone, maybe the County Historical Society or a mining expert, but Mason had never been good at the smart thing. He flipped the latch and lifted the lid. Inside were papers, dozens of them, yellowed with age but still legible. Hand-drawn maps, geological surveys, and what looked like journal entries written in cramped, careful handwriting. Mason spread them out on the porch, organizing them by date as best he could. The earliest document was dated June 14, 1956. It was a letter from a geological survey company in Phoenix to Raymond Blackwell, confirming receipt of rock samples and promising a full analysis within 6 weeks. Mason shuffled through the papers until he found the response, dated August 2nd, 1956. The language was technical, full of terms like rare earth elements and anomalous metallic compounds, but the conclusion was clear enough. The samples Raymond had submitted showed concentrations of minerals that shouldn't exist together in nature. The survey company recommended immediate follow-up, detailed mapping of the site, and consultation with the university geology department. But there was no record of Raymond doing any of that. Instead, the next dated entry was a journal page from September 1956. Bought the canyon property today. Seller thought I was crazy paying $3,000 for worthless land. Let him think that. What I found down there is worth 100 times that, maybe 1,000. But I can't tell anyone. The moment I do, they'll take it from me. Big mining companies, government, doesn't matter. A man like me doesn't get to keep something this big. So I'll keep it secret. I'll keep it safe. And when the time is right, when I understand what it really is, then maybe I'll share it with the world. Mason sat back against the cabin wall, his mind reeling. Raymond hadn't been crazy. He'd been protecting something he knew would be stolen if anyone found out about it. And apparently, he'd spent the next 30 years trying to understand what he'd discovered. The next several pages were detailed maps of the cave system. Raymond had been thorough, measuring every passage, every chamber, documenting multiple levels that extended far deeper than the one chamber Mason had found. According to these maps, what he'd seen yesterday was just the entrance to a network that dropped more than 300 feet into the canyon bedrock. One map in particular caught Mason's attention. It showed the cabin, the canyon floor, and the cave entrance he'd found, but it also showed something else. A second entrance, accessed not from the canyon floor but from somewhere inside the cabin itself. A passage that led down through the rock shelf the cabin sat on, connecting to the main chamber system from above. Mason stared at the cabin behind him. A second entrance, hidden somewhere inside. He'd been living here for 3 days and hadn't noticed it, which meant it was well concealed. But if Raymond's maps were accurate, and they seemed to be, then there was a way to access the caves without the dangerous climb across the canyon floor. He gathered up the papers carefully and took them inside. The map showed the passage entrance in the northeastern corner of the main room, behind where the old cook stove would have sat. Mason moved to that corner and began examining every stone, every board, looking for the mechanism. It took him an hour of searching before he found it. Not in the floor or walls, but in the ceiling. A wooden beam that looked like all the others, but had a small metal ring embedded in one end, almost invisible unless you were looking straight up at it from the right angle. Mason grabbed his folding ladder from his supplies and climbed up for a closer look. The ring was attached to a latch mechanism. When he pulled it, a section of the ceiling, roughly 3 feet square, dropped down on hidden hinges. Behind it was darkness and the smell of stone. A ladder made of metal rungs had been bolted directly into the rock, descending into shadow. Mason climbed down from his ladder and stood staring up at the opening. This was it. This was how Raymond had accessed the caves for 30 years, in comfort and safety, without anyone knowing. No wonder he'd been willing to live without electricity or running water. The cabin wasn't his home. It was just the doorway to his real work, whatever that had been. He grabbed his best flashlight, the heavy-duty one with fresh batteries, and started up the ladder again. The metal rungs were cold under his hands, but solid, well-maintained. Raymond had cared for this passage, had used it regularly. Mason climbed through the ceiling opening and found himself in a vertical shaft, maybe 4 feet square, with the metal ladder continuing down into darkness. He descended slowly, counting rungs. At 30, the shaft opened into a horizontal passage. At 50, it widened into a small chamber. At 70, his feet touched solid ground, and he found himself standing in a space he recognized from the maps. This was one of the upper chambers, part of the network that connected to the main vault below. But this chamber was different from the one he'd found yesterday. This one had been set up as a workspace. A wooden table sat against one wall, still holding tools, notebooks, and what looked like scientific equipment. Battery-powered lanterns hung from hooks in the ceiling, and when Mason tried one, it flickered to life, casting warm yellow light across the space. Raymond had spent serious time here. The table was covered with rock samples, each one carefully labeled and dated. Most were from the 1980s and 90s, suggesting he'd been actively working on understanding his discovery right up until his death in 2007. Mason picked up one of the notebooks and began reading. The entries were sporadic, sometimes weeks or months between them, but they told a consistent story. Raymond had become convinced that the metallic formations in the deeper caves weren't just unusual geology. They were something intentionally created, or at least intentionally modified. He'd found tool marks in some of the deeper passages, markings that predated any known mining activity in the region by centuries, possibly millennia. March 12, 1989, one entry read, "Descended to the 7th level today. The formations there are definitely not natural. The patterns are too precise, too mathematical. Someone carved these chambers, shaped these veins of metal into specific configurations. But who? And when? The indigenous peoples of this region had no mining technology advanced enough for this kind of work. And the Spanish conquistadors kept detailed records of their expeditions. None mention anything like this." Another entry, dated July 4, 1994. "I've been thinking about the old stories the Navajo elders used to tell, about the ancient ones who lived in the canyons before humans walked the earth, about cities carved into living rock, about treasures hidden so deep the sun never touched them. I always thought they were just myths, stories to explain the ruins scattered across this land. But what if they weren't myths? What if something was here before us, something that knew how to work metal and stone in ways we still don't understand?" Mason set down the notebook, his skin prickling. This was getting into territory that made his rational contractor's mind rebel. Ancient civilizations, pre-human artifacts, it sounded like the kind of thing you'd read in a tabloid newspaper while waiting in line at the grocery store. But Raymond Blackwell hadn't been a crackpot. His early surveys, his methodical documentation, his careful scientific approach, all of it spoke to a man who dealt in facts, not fantasies. And Mason had felt that vibration himself, had seen those geometric patterns in the stone. Something about this place was genuinely unusual, whether or not Raymond's theories about ancient civilizations held any truth. He continued exploring the chamber, cataloging everything he found. More rock samples, more notebooks, and on a shelf carved into the far wall, a series of small wooden boxes similar to the one he'd found in the cabin. He opened the first one and found himself looking at what could only be described as treasure. Gold nuggets, dozens of them, ranging from the size of a pea to the size of a walnut. Not raw ore that needed refining, but pure gold, naturally formed into those distinctive rounded shapes. The box must have weighed 5 or 6 pounds, which meant, Mason calculated quickly, somewhere around $90,000 worth of gold at current prices. He opened the second box. More gold, but also silver and what looked like platinum. The third box held gemstones, rough cut but clearly valuable. Rubies, emeralds, sapphires, all mixed together like candy in a jar. The fourth box contained what Mason first thought were rocks, until he picked one up and felt its weight. These weren't rocks. They were solid chunks of metal, dull grey silver, remarkably heavy. Platinum maybe, or something even rarer. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Mason sat down hard on the stone floor, his legs suddenly unable to support him. This wasn't just an interesting geological formation. This was wealth beyond anything he'd imagined. Even with just the contents of these 4 boxes, he was looking at $500,000, maybe more. And according to Raymond's maps, there were 7 more levels below this one, each potentially holding more. But why had Raymond lived in poverty if he'd had access to all this? The man had died alone in a cabin without electricity, and the county had seized the property for back taxes of less than $10,000. If he'd had this kind of wealth, why hadn't he used it? Mason picked up another notebook, this one from later in Raymond's life. The handwriting was shakier, the entries shorter. He flipped to one of the last pages, dated February 19th, 2006, just over a year before Raymond's death. I'm 78 years old today. My hands shake too much to work the deeper passages anymore. My eyes aren't what they were. I know I don't have much time left. Part of me wants to tell someone about this place, to share the discovery before I die. But every time I consider it, I think about what would happen. They'd turn this canyon into a mine. They'd rip it apart looking for more. They'd destroy something ancient and sacred because men see gold and lose their minds. The entry continued. So I've made a decision. I'll take enough to live on, just enough to keep the property taxes paid and food on my table. The rest stays here, hidden, protected. Maybe someday the right person will find it. Someone who understands that some things are more valuable than money. Someone who will preserve this place instead of destroying it. Until then, let it sleep. Let the canyon keep its secrets. Mason closed the notebook and sat in silence for a long time. Raymond hadn't been protecting treasure for himself. He'd been protecting it from everyone, including himself. He'd lived in poverty as a guardian, not as a miser. And now that responsibility had fallen to Mason, whether he wanted it or not. He stood and continued his exploration, moving deeper into the passage system. Raymond's maps showed a main shaft that descended through the rock in a spiral pattern, connecting 7 distinct levels. Mason found the shaft easily enough, a natural fissure that had been widened and equipped with metal rungs similar to the entrance ladder. He descended to the 2nd level, then the 3rd, each one revealing similar chambers filled with Raymond's equipment and samples. But it wasn't until he reached the 4th level that he found what Raymond had called the main vault in his maps. The passage opened into a cavern so large Mason's flashlight couldn't reach the far walls. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above him, and the sound of his breathing echoed back from distant stone. But what made him freeze, what made his breath catch in his throat, were the formations. They covered every surface, flowing across walls and ceiling like frozen waterfalls of liquid metal. Gold, silver, copper, and other metals Mason couldn't immediately identify, all twisted together in patterns that hurt to look at too long. Geometric shapes that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Crystalline structures that caught his flashlight beam and threw it back in rainbow fragments. And in the center of it all, rising from the cavern floor like a pillar holding up the sky, was a formation that made the one he'd seen yesterday look like a pebble. It must have been 30 feet tall and 20 feet across at its widest point, composed entirely of that same strange metallic stone, veins running through it in patterns so complex they looked like circuitry, like someone had carved a computer chip the size of a house. Mason approached it slowly, almost reverently. Up close, he could see details that defied explanation. The metal veins didn't just run through the surface, they were embedded at different depths, creating a 3-dimensional pattern that extended into the heart of the formation. Some of the veins glowed faintly, a soft blue-green luminescence that had nothing to do with his flashlight. He reached out and touched it, and the moment his palm made contact, the entire cavern seemed to wake up. The humming sound he'd heard before returned, but louder, more insistent. The glowing veins brightened, pulsing in a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. And from somewhere deep below, from the levels he hadn't explored yet, came a sound like grinding stone, like massive gears turning after centuries of stillness. Mason jerked his hand back, and the phenomena stopped immediately. The glow faded. The humming ceased. The grinding sound echoed away into silence. He stood there, hand still raised, heart hammering against his ribs, trying to understand what had just happened. This wasn't geology. This was something else. Something that responded to human touch, that contained some kind of energy or mechanism that activated on contact. Raymond's theories about ancient civilizations suddenly didn't seem so crazy. What if something had been here before? Something with technology that looked like magic to modern eyes? He spent the next hour exploring the main vault carefully, not touching anything else, just observing and documenting with his phone camera. The formation in the center was clearly the heart of whatever this was, but the entire cavern was part of the same system. The metallic veins in the walls all led back to the central pillar, connecting like blood vessels to a heart. And everywhere he looked, he found evidence of intentional design. Channels carved into the floor that might have carried water or some other liquid. Alcoves in the walls that could have held equipment or supplies, markings on certain stones that looked almost like writing, though in no alphabet Mason recognized. He found Raymond's final workstation on a ledge overlooking the main vault, and it was here that the old man's last journals waited. Mason sat down and began reading by the light of his phone, learning the full story of what Raymond Blackwell had discovered and what he'd spent 30 years trying to understand. The entries painted a picture of growing obsession tempered by scientific discipline. Raymond had tested samples from the formations and found metals that shouldn't exist in these combinations. He documented energy readings that made no sense according to known physics. He'd discovered chambers on the lower levels that contained artifacts, actual manufactured objects that predated any known human civilization in North America by thousands of years. November 8, 2004, one entry read, "I finally made it to the 7th level today. It nearly killed me. The climb is that dangerous, but I had to see it for myself. There's a chamber down there, perfectly circular, about 40 feet across. The walls are covered in those markings I've been finding throughout the system, but down there they're complete. They tell a story, or maybe give instructions, I can't be sure. And in the center of that chamber is a door, an actual door, made of metal that doesn't rust or tarnish, set into the rock as if it grew there. I couldn't open it, couldn't even make it move, but it's there, waiting. Whatever this place really is, whatever its true purpose, the answer is behind that door. I know it." Mason flipped through the remaining pages, but there were no more entries about the 7th level. Raymond's health had declined after that expedition, and his later writings focused on preservation rather than exploration. He'd spent his final years reinforcing passages, securing chambers, and creating the maps that would allow someone else to navigate the system safely. The last entry in the journal was dated March 7, 2007, less than 2 months before Raymond's death. "I've done everything I can to protect this place. Hidden the entrances, spread stories about curses to keep people away, made sure the property would go to county auction rather than private sale, so no corporation could snap it up. Whoever buys it next will think they're getting a worthless piece of canyon land. But if they're curious enough, if they're willing to look beyond what everyone else sees, they'll find what I found. And maybe, just maybe, they'll be the one who finally understands what it all means. The treasure is just a test. Anyone can see the value in gold and gems, but the real treasure is deeper. The real treasure is truth, whatever that truth turns out to be." Mason closed the journal and sat in the darkness for a long time. He was that person now, the curious fool who'd looked beyond what everyone else saw. And he'd found exactly what Raymond had left for him. A mystery wrapped in treasure, wrapped in questions that might never have answers. He climbed back up to the cabin as afternoon faded into evening, his mind spinning with everything he'd learned. The boxes of gold and gems remained in the upper chamber. He'd secured the ceiling hatch, but he hadn't brought anything valuable to the surface. Some instinct told him to leave it where it was, at least until he understood the full scope of what he was dealing with. That night, he sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky and thought about choices. He could report this discovery to the authorities, which would mean investigations, mineral rights disputes, and probably losing everything to government claims and corporate mining interests. He could try to secretly sell the treasure piece by piece, which would make him wealthy but leave him constantly looking over his shoulder, always worried about being caught. Or he could do what Raymond Blackwell had done: guard it, study it, try to understand what it really was before deciding what to do with it. That option meant staying here, in this isolated canyon, probably for years. It meant giving up any chance of returning to his old life, his old profession, the world he'd known before. But what was there to go back to? A failed business, a rented room above a hardware store, the pity and judgment of people who'd written him off as a failure? No. He'd found something here that was bigger than himself, bigger than money, maybe bigger than anything he'd ever be part of again. Raymond Blackwell had trusted him, without ever meeting him, to be the right person for this. And Mason wasn't going to let him down. He spent the next 3 days doing exactly what he'd told Dale Simmons he would do, fixing up the cabin. He repaired the roof properly, replaced broken windows, patched holes in the walls. To anyone watching from town, he looked like a fool, making a worthless property slightly less worthless. But Mason wasn't fixing the cabin for appearance. He was making it genuinely livable because he was planning to stay. On the 4th day, Iris Whitman returned. She pulled up in her dusty Jeep around noon and found Mason replacing boards on the porch. He'd half expected her, had actually been surprised she'd stayed away this long. "How's it going?" she called out as she climbed from the vehicle. "Good. Better than expected." Mason set down his hammer. "Place has good bones, just needed some attention." Iris walked up onto the newly reinforced porch and looked around approvingly. "You've done solid work. Quick work, too." She paused. "Find anything interesting while you were fixing things up?" The question was casual, but Mason caught the weight behind it. She knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough to ask careful questions. He made a decision in that moment to trust her, at least partially. "Might have," he said slowly. "You know anything about Raymond Blackwell, beyond what the town says about him going crazy?" Iris was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I knew Raymond. Not well, but we talked sometimes. He used to come to the ranch maybe twice a year to buy supplies. Always paid in gold nuggets." She met Mason's eyes. "I never asked where he got them, and he never offered to tell me. But I knew he'd found something out here, something that made him choose isolation over comfort." "Did he ever tell you what it was?" "No, but about a year before he died, he came by the ranch looking worse than I'd ever seen him. Thin, shaky, probably hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. I tried to give him food, but he wouldn't take it. Just looked at me with these tired eyes and said, 'When I'm gone, someone else will come. Someone who'll need a friend out here. Be that friend, Iris. Help them understand that some secrets are worth keeping.'" She paused. "I didn't know what he meant until you showed up." Mason leaned against the porch railing, studying her weathered face. "If I told you I found something down there that doesn't make sense, that might be worth millions, or might be worthless depending on how it's handled, what would you say?" "I'd say that sounds about right for Raymond's Canyon." Iris smiled slightly. "And I'd ask what you plan to do about it." "Haven't decided yet. Still trying to understand what I'm dealing with." "Fair enough." She walked to the edge of the porch and looked out over the canyon. "But whatever you decide, know that you're not alone out here. Raymond thought he had to protect his secrets completely by himself, and it damn near killed him years before his body actually gave out. Don't make that same mistake." She left shortly after, but her words stayed with Mason. He'd been so focused on the discovery, on understanding the mystery Raymond had left behind, that he hadn't thought about the burden of keeping it secret. Raymond had paid for that isolation with his health, his connections, ultimately his life. Was Mason willing to do the same? And more importantly, was there another way? Some path between the extremes of revealing everything and hiding it all forever? That night, he descended into the caves again, this time with better equipment and a specific goal. He wanted to see the 7th level, wanted to find that door Raymond had written about in his final expedition. The climb down was treacherous, each level more dangerous than the last. Some of the passages were barely wide enough to squeeze through. Others required climbing down sheer rock faces using handholds that might have been carved centuries ago or might be natural features worn smooth by ancient water. But he made it. 4 hours after leaving the cabin, Mason stood in the 7th level chamber and understood why Raymond had called it the end of everything. The 7th level chamber was nothing like the others. Where the upper levels showed evidence of human modification mixed with natural cave formation, this place was entirely artificial. The walls were smooth, almost polished, forming a perfect circle exactly as Raymond had described. And covering every inch of those walls, from floor to ceiling, were the markings. Mason ran his flashlight beam across them slowly, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. They weren't quite writing, at least not in any conventional sense. More like diagrams, mathematical equations, star charts maybe, all interconnected in ways that suggested deep meaning if only he could decipher it. Some symbols repeated throughout the patterns, others appeared only once, in positions that seemed significant. But it was the door that held his attention. Set into the far wall, seamless and perfect, a rectangle of metal approximately 8 feet tall and 5 feet wide. The surface was smooth as glass, unmarked except for a single handprint carved into the center at shoulder height. Not worn by time or use, but deliberately shaped into the metal as if someone had pressed their palm into soft clay and let it harden. Mason approached slowly, his boots echoing on the stone floor. The air down here was different, denser somehow, and carried a metallic taste that coated his tongue. The temperature was cool but not cold, maintained at a constant level despite being hundreds of feet underground. He stood in front of the door and examined it closely. No hinges visible on this side, no lock, no handle, no mechanism he could identify. Just the handprint, waiting. Raymond had written that he couldn't open it, couldn't even make it move. But Raymond had been in his 70s by then, weakened by years of malnutrition and isolation. Mason raised his hand and placed it over the carved print. His palm didn't quite match the size or shape, but close enough. Nothing happened. He pressed harder, feeling the cold metal against his skin. Still nothing. He was about to pull away when he felt it. A faint vibration, the same kind he'd experienced touching the formations above. The vibration intensified, spreading from his palm up his arm, and the metal under his hand began to warm. The edges of the handprint started glowing with that same blue-green light he'd seen in the main vault. Lines of light spread from the print across the door's surface, racing along channels too fine to see with the naked eye, creating patterns that matched the markings on the surrounding walls. The door didn't swing open. It simply vanished, dissolving into the wall as if it had never been solid at all. Beyond lay another passage, this one carved with mathematical precision, walls meeting floor and ceiling at perfect right angles. And at the end of that passage, perhaps 50 feet away, Mason could see light. Not the cold blue-green of the formations, but warm, golden light, like sunlight filtered through amber. He stepped through the doorway, half expecting it to slam shut behind him, or the ceiling to collapse, or some ancient trap to spring. But nothing happened. Just his footsteps echoing down the corridor as he walked toward that impossible light. The passage opened into a chamber that made Mason stop dead in his tracks. It was vast, easily 100 feet across and 50 high, but what stunned him wasn't the size. It was what the chamber contained. Shelves carved into the living rock lined every wall, and on those shelves sat objects that shouldn't exist. Not here, not anywhere in this canyon, possibly not anywhere in the known world. Mason walked forward in a daze, his flashlight suddenly unnecessary in the golden glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The first shelf held pottery, but not the crude earthenware of the ancestral Puebloans who'd lived in these canyons centuries ago. These were pieces of stunning sophistication, glazed in colors that seemed to shift as he looked at them, decorated with the same geometric patterns that covered the walls outside. He picked one up carefully and felt its weight, the perfect balance of it, the craftsmanship that spoke of mastery beyond anything he'd seen in museums. The next shelf held tools, implements whose purpose he could only guess at. Some looked like surgical instruments, others resembled astronomical devices. All were made from that same untarnishable metal as the door, precisely machined, still sharp and functional after what must have been centuries or millennia of abandonment. But it was the third section of shelving that made his knees weak. Ingots of metal, stacked like cordwood, each one stamped with markings he couldn't read. He picked one up and nearly dropped it from the weight. Gold, definitely gold, but alloyed with something that made it harder, more durable than pure gold should be. He counted quickly, 30 ingots per shelf, 12 shelves in this section alone. Each ingot looked to be roughly 20 pounds. Mason did the math in his head. 20 pounds was roughly 300 troy ounces. At current gold prices, around $2,000 per ounce, each ingot was worth $600,000. 30 ingots per shelf meant 18 million per shelf. 12 shelves meant over $200 million in gold alone, assuming that's what it was. He sat down hard on the stone floor, his flashlight clattering beside him. This wasn't just a discovery. This was history-changing wealth, the kind that could fund universities or start wars depending on who controlled it. And it was sitting in a chamber beneath his $950 property, untouched and unknown to the modern world. But as Mason's racing heart began to slow, his contractor's mind started working again. This amount of processed metal didn't happen by accident. Someone had mined it, refined it, shaped it into ingots, and stored it here. The question was who and when, and most importantly, why. He stood and continued his exploration. Beyond the shelves of artifacts and metal, he found what looked like a library, stone tablets covered in the same marking system, organized on shelves with the same care as the artifacts. Some tablets were small, palm-sized. Others were massive, requiring both hands to lift. All were precisely carved, the symbols cut deep into the stone with tools that left no marks or roughness. And at the far end of the chamber, set into an alcove lit by its own sources, was a single pedestal. On that pedestal sat an object that looked like a map, but rendered in 3 dimensions, carved from a single piece of translucent crystal. Mason approached it carefully, almost afraid to breathe on it. The crystal map showed terrain he recognized, the canyon systems of this region, rendered in miniature with stunning accuracy. But it also showed things that shouldn't be there. Passages marked through solid rock, chambers in locations where modern geological surveys showed nothing, and a network of connections that suggested the caves under his property were just one small part of a much larger system stretching for miles in every direction. Red markings highlighted certain locations throughout the network. Mason counted them quickly, 17 in total, each one indicating a site similar to this one. 17 vaults hidden throughout the canyonlands, all connected, all presumably containing similar treasures. The scope of it was staggering. He took photos of everything, documenting the chamber from every angle, knowing even as he did it that photographs could never capture the reality of this place. Then he carefully made his way back through the passage. The door had remained open, or perhaps hadn't really been a door at all, just some kind of energy field that responded to human contact. The climb back to the surface took 5 hours, and by the time Mason hauled himself through the ceiling hatch into the cabin, dawn was breaking. He was exhausted, filthy, and his mind was so overwhelmed with what he'd seen that he could barely form coherent thoughts. He made coffee with shaking hands and sat on the porch watching the sun paint the canyon walls in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere out there, in 17 other locations, similar vaults waited. Raymond had only found this one, had spent 30 years studying just this one site. The full scope of whatever ancient civilization had created all this was beyond anything modern archaeology had documented, and now Mason had to decide what to do with that knowledge. The responsible thing would be to contact authorities, maybe the State Archaeological Society or a university. But he'd seen enough of how the world worked to know what would happen then. The site would be seized, classified, probably looted by whoever got there first, whether that was legitimate researchers or treasure hunters who'd hear about it through the inevitable leaks. Raymond had understood that. That's why he'd kept it secret, had died protecting it rather than revealing it. But could Mason do the same? Did he have the strength to guard this alone for decades, to let the weight of it crush him slowly the way it had crushed Raymond? He was still wrestling with these questions when he heard the sound of an engine approaching. Not Iris's familiar Jeep, but something heavier, moving faster than was safe on the narrow canyon trail. Mason stood, instinctively wary, and watched as a black Ford Expedition rounded the bend and skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust. 3 men climbed out. They wore expensive outdoor gear, the kind that looked rugged but had never seen actual work. The one in front was probably in his 50s, silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, the bearing of someone used to being obeyed. The two behind him were younger, harder, the kind of men who got paid to stand behind important people and look intimidating. "Mason Carter!" the silver-haired man called out. "That's me. Can I help you?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Richard Ashford. I represent certain interests that have taken notice of your recent property acquisition. Mind if we talk?" Mason didn't move from the porch. "Depends on what you want to talk about. May I?" Ashford gestured toward the porch steps. Mason nodded, and the man climbed up alone, leaving his two associates by the vehicle. Up close, Ashford's expensive clothes couldn't hide the predatory calculation in his eyes. "You bought this property at auction for less than $1,000. That's quite a bargain." Seemed like a good deal at the time. Indeed, especially given what's beneath it. Ashford let that statement hang in the air between them. "We've been monitoring this site for quite some time, Mr. Carter. The previous owner, Raymond Blackwell, was very good at keeping secrets, but he's been dead for 18 years now, and secrets have a way of coming to light." "I don't know what you're talking about." Ashford's smile widened. "Of course you don't. You're just a simple contractor fixing up an old cabin. Except you've been spending an awful lot of time underground for someone focused on roof repairs, and you've been making inquiries about mineral rights, geological surveys, archaeological preservation laws." Mason's blood ran cold. He'd been careful, or so he thought, but apparently not careful enough. "You've been watching me." "We've been watching this property for the better part of a decade, waiting for someone to finally purchase it. Waiting for someone curious enough to find what Raymond Blackwell found." Ashford pulled a folded document from his jacket. "We're prepared to offer you $2 million for the property, as is. You walk away, we take ownership, everyone's happy." "And if I'm not interested in selling?" The smile disappeared. "Then we move to less pleasant alternatives. Eminent domain claims, environmental violations, archaeological restrictions that make it illegal for you to set foot in your own caves. We have lawyers, Mr. Carter, very good lawyers. And we have patience. We can tie you up in court for years while the property taxes and legal fees bleed you dry. Or," the smile returned, cold and sharp, "you can take the $2 million and walk away rich." Mason studied him for a long moment. "Who do you represent?" "Consortium of private collectors and research institutions, people who understand the value of what's down there and have the resources to properly excavate and study it." "You mean loot and sell it?" Ashford shrugged. "Semantics. The point is, you're in over your head. You're a failed contractor living in a ruin. You don't have the knowledge, the funding, or the legal framework to do anything meaningful with this discovery. We do. Take the smart play, Mr. Carter. Take the money." "I'll think about it." "You have 48 hours. Ashford descended the porch steps, then paused and looked back. "One more thing. There are other parties interested in this site. Not everyone is as civilized as we are. If you won't sell to us, I can't guarantee your safety if you try to stay." The three men climbed back into the expedition and drove away, leaving Mason standing on his porch with his heart racing and his mind spinning. They knew. Not everything, probably, but enough. Which meant Raymond's careful secrecy had been compromised at some point, maybe years ago. Maybe there had always been people watching and waiting for their chance. He went inside and pulled out his phone, but there was no signal this deep in the canyon. He'd have to drive to town if he wanted to call anyone. But who would he call? The police? And tell them what? That mysterious men were offering him money for his property? That wasn't a crime. His lawyer? He didn't have one. Iris? Maybe. But what could she do against people with the kind of resources Ashford represented? For the first time since finding the vault, Mason felt genuine fear. Not the excited nervousness of discovery, but cold dread at the realization that he'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than he'd understood. There were people who'd been waiting for this, planning for it, and they weren't going to let one broke contractor stand in their way. That night, Mason didn't sleep. He sat by the fireplace with Raymond's journals spread around him, reading by lamplight, trying to find any mention of outside parties or threats. He found it in an entry from January 3rd, 1993. They came again today, different people this time, but same questions. How deep do the caves go? Have I found anything valuable? Would I consider selling? I told them the same thing I always tell them. The property isn't for sale. There's nothing down there but rocks and bat droppings, and they should stop wasting their time. But they don't believe me. I can see it in their eyes. They know I found something. Maybe they have satellite surveys or ground-penetrating radar. Maybe they've found other sites in the network. Either way, they're circling like vultures. I need to be more careful. Need to hide the evidence better. So Raymond had dealt with these people, or people like them, for years. He'd held them off through stubbornness and misdirection, but eventually they'd worn him down. The isolation, the constant stress of guarding the secret, it had cost him everything. And now they were back, putting the same pressure on Mason. He thought about the offer. $2 million was more money than he'd ever imagined having. He could pay off his debts, start over somewhere new, live comfortably for the rest of his life. And all he had to do was walk away from a crumbling cabin and some caves full of ancient artifacts that weren't really his anyway. But every time he considered it, he thought about that 7th-level chamber, the golden light, the shelves of impossible artifacts, the crystal map showing 17 sites. This wasn't just about money. This was about history, about understanding something that predated everything modern archaeology thought it knew about this continent. Walking away meant letting people like Ashford loot it, sell it off piece by piece to private collectors, hide the truth because it didn't fit conventional narratives. Raymond had understood that. That's why he'd sacrificed his comfort, his connections, his health. Not for the gold, he could have sold that any time. For the truth, for the preservation of something irreplaceable. Could Mason do any less? Dawn found him still awake, sitting on the porch, watching the canyon come to life with morning light. He'd made his decision, though it scared him more than anything he'd ever done. He wasn't selling, not to Ashford, not to anyone. He was going to do what Raymond had done, guard this place, study it, try to understand it. And when he fully understood what it was, then he'd decide how to share it with the world. On his terms, not theirs, but he couldn't do it alone. Raymond's mistake had been trying to handle everything himself. Mason needed allies, people he could trust, people with resources and knowledge he lacked. He spent the day securing the cabin and the vault entrances. He reinforced the ceiling hatch, added additional locks, and took photos of everything in the 7th-level chamber, storing the images on multiple encrypted drives. If something happened to him, at least there would be a record. Then he drove to town and straight to the Whitman ranch. Iris answered the door in dusty work clothes, clearly in the middle of something, but her expression changed when she saw Mason's face. "What happened?" she asked. "We need to talk. Privately." She led him to her kitchen, poured 2 glasses of iced tea, and sat down across from him. "Tell me." So he did. Everything. The vault, the 7th level, the artifacts worth hundreds of millions, the crystal map showing 17 sites, and Richard Ashford's visit with his $2 million offer and his thinly veiled threats. When he finished, Iris sat back in her chair and let out a long breath. "Well," she said finally, "that's a lot. I know, and I know it sounds insane. Actually, it sounds exactly like what I expected." She stood and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a box similar to the one Mason had found in the cabin. "Raymond gave me this about 6 months before he died. Said if anything happened to him, I should give it to whoever bought the property next. Said they'd need what was inside." She set the box on the table and opened it. Inside were more documents, but also something else, a list of names and addresses. Mason picked it up and scanned through them. Archaeologists, geologists, anthropologists, all at major universities, all with notations in Raymond's handwriting. Trustworthy, has seen anomalous sites before, won't immediately call authorities. He was building a network, Mason said slowly. People who could help study the sites without turning them into a media circus. Or a gold rush, Iris added. Raymond knew he couldn't protect everything alone. He was trying to create a coalition of people who'd prioritize preservation and understanding over profit. Did he ever contact any of them? I don't think so. I think he was still too scared of what might happen if word got out. She looked at Mason steadily. But you're not Raymond. You're younger, stronger, and you haven't spent 30 years in isolation. You could do what he couldn't. You could bring the right people in, create a proper research project, find a way to protect the sites while still studying them. Mason looked at the list of names. 17 sites. $200 million or more in gold alone. Artifacts that could rewrite the history of this continent. And somewhere out there, people like Richard Ashford circling, waiting for their chance to seize it all. The smart play was still to walk away. But Mason had never been good at the smart play. I'm going to need help, he said. Real help. Lawyers, security, researchers I can trust. This is bigger than one person can handle. Iris smiled. Then it's good you've got a 73-year-old cattle rancher on your side. I might not look like much, but I know people, and I've been preparing for this day since Raymond first asked me to watch over whoever came next. Over the next week, they worked quickly and quietly. Iris connected Mason with a lawyer in Santa Fe who specialized in archaeological site protection. The lawyer set up a non-profit organization with Mason as director, creating a legal framework that made the property harder to seize through eminent domain or other challenges. Meanwhile, Mason reached out to the first name on Raymond's list, a geologist at the University of New Mexico named Dr. Sarah Chen. He sent her carefully edited photos of some of the artifacts, nothing that revealed location or full scope, just enough to pique her professional interest. Her response came within hours. Where did you find this? These alloys shouldn't exist in pre-Columbian North America. We need to talk, now. They met at a diner in Albuquerque, neutral ground where they could assess each other. Dr. Chen was younger than Mason expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and an intensity that reminded him of Raymond's journals. He showed her more photos, told her enough to make clear the magnitude of the discovery, and watched her expression shift from skepticism to wonder to professional excitement. This is Nobel Prize-level material, she said quietly. If it's authentic, and from your photos I believe it is, this completely changes our understanding of metallurgy in ancient Americas. It's authentic, Mason assured her. But there's a problem. There are people who want to seize the site, people with money and lawyers and no interest in proper archaeological protocol. I need help protecting it long enough to do real research. Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. You need a coalition. Multiple universities, multiple research groups, all with documented interest in the site. Make it politically and legally messy to try to seize. Create enough legitimate claim that no single entity can just sweep in and take over. Can you help with that? I can contact colleagues at other institutions, people I trust to prioritize research over profit. She paused. But eventually this will go public. You understand that? Once enough people know, you won't be able to keep it secret anymore. I know, Mason said. I'm not trying to hide it forever. I just want to make sure when it does go public it's done right. Protected, studied properly, not looted and sold to private collectors. They talked for another 2 hours, planning strategy. Dr. Chen would bring in carefully selected colleagues, each one adding another layer of institutional protection. Mason would continue documenting everything, building an archive that couldn't be suppressed or destroyed, and Iris would handle security, making sure no one accessed the site without authorization. When Ashford's 48-hour deadline passed with no response, Mason half expected more threats, maybe an attempt to force him off the property. Instead, there was silence. A week went by, then two, with no sign of Ashford or his associates. It made Mason nervous. Men like that didn't just give up when told no. They were planning something, waiting for the right moment. He increased security around the property, installed cameras on the trail, and made sure someone always knew where he was. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Chen, digging through historical records for any mention of anomalous finds in the region, discovered something interesting. Richard Ashford wasn't just a representative of private collectors. He was the grandson of a mining executive who'd tried to buy Raymond Blackwell's property back in 1968. The attempt had failed, but apparently the family had never stopped trying. "They've been after this for 3 generations, Dr. Chen told Mason over the phone. "Your predecessor held them off for 50 years. Now they see you as the weak link, someone they can pressure or buy out." "They're going to be disappointed," Mason said grimly. But the real shock came when Dr. Chen sent him another piece of information she'd uncovered. "I found records of mining claims filed in this region between 1920 and 1940. Most were legitimate silver and copper operations, but there's one claim that was filed and then immediately sealed under national security orders. The location matches your property almost exactly." National security in 1940? Right around the time the Manhattan Project was ramping up. They were looking everywhere for rare minerals, anything that might have applications in atomic research. What if someone found your vault back then, realized what was there and classified it? Then why didn't they excavate it? Maybe they tried and couldn't access the lower levels. Or maybe they decided whatever was there was too sensitive to risk making public. She paused. The point is, this site has been on someone's radar for nearly a century. Raymond Blackwell wasn't the first to find it. He was just the first to successfully keep it secret. Mason absorbed that information slowly. It changed everything. This wasn't just about ancient artifacts. This was about secrets that stretched back through generations, about powerful interests that had been circling this place since before his parents were born. He thought about Raymond, living alone for 30 years, dying in isolation to protect something he'd spent his life studying. He thought about the 17 sites marked on that crystal map, each one potentially holding similar treasures, and he thought about his own choice, to stay or to walk away, to fight or to fold. The smart play had always been to walk away. But standing on his porch that evening, watching the sun set over the canyon that had become his home, Mason knew he'd never been the type for smart plays. He was the type who bought worthless property and found impossible treasures, the type who read cursed land and heard opportunity. Tomorrow, Dr. Chen and 3 colleagues were driving out to conduct the first official survey of the site. Next week, the lawyers would file paperwork establishing the non-profit's claim. Within a month, there would be enough institutional interest that forcing Mason off the property would require fighting 6 universities and research foundations. Richard Ashford and whoever he represented would eventually make another move. Mason knew that. But by then, he wouldn't be alone. He'd have allies, resources, and most importantly, he'd have the truth documented and distributed widely enough that no one could suppress it. Raymond Blackwell had tried to guard this place alone, and it had broken him. But Mason Carter had learned from that mistake. He was building something different. Not just protection, but understanding. Not just secrecy, but eventual revelation on terms that honored what this place represented. As stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Mason allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt since before his divorce, before his business failed, before everything had fallen apart. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a drowning man grasping at straws, but solid hope built on real foundations. He'd come to this canyon looking for a fresh start. What he'd found was a purpose bigger than himself, a legacy that stretched back millennia and forward into an unknown future. The fool who'd bought a worthless cabin was gone. In his place stood the guardian of something irreplaceable, the inheritor of Raymond Blackwell's final wish, the man who would finally share these secrets with the world in a way that honored both their value and their mystery. And as the canyon settled into night around him, Mason smiled. They'd laughed when he moved into this cabin. They'd called him crazy, desperate, foolish. Tomorrow, when the first researchers arrived, that laughter would begin to fade. And someday soon, when the truth about what lay beneath this canyon finally emerged, the whole world would understand what he'd known from the moment he'd opened that first hidden door. That sometimes the biggest treasures are hidden in the places everyone else is too afraid to look. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at dawn with 3 colleagues, their university van loaded with equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction film. ground-penetrating radar, spectrographic analyzers, carbon dating kits, and enough recording equipment to document every inch of the vault. Mason met them at the trailhead, his stomach knotted with anxiety he tried not to show. "Mr. Carter?" Dr. Chen said, extending her hand. "Ready to change history?" He led them down the trail to the cabin, watching their reactions as the property came into view. To his surprise, none of them looked disappointed. Dr. Marcus Webb, a geologist from Stanford, actually smiled. "Perfect isolation. No contamination from modern development. This is ideal for preservation." Inside the cabin, Mason showed them the ceiling hatch. The four researchers exchanged glances that Mason couldn't quite read. Then Dr. Chen looked at him steadily. "Before we go down, you need to understand what happens next. Once we document what's there, once we verify its authenticity, this stops being your private discovery. It becomes a scientific site of international importance. Your life will never be the same." "I know," Mason said. "I've known since I found it." The descent took over an hour, the researchers stopping at every level to take readings, collect samples, photograph everything. Mason had seen their excitement before, the way Raymond's journals described his own first explorations. But watching professional scientists react to the formations, seeing their hands shake as they examined the artifacts, somehow made it more real. When they finally reached the 7th-level chamber, when that golden light spilled over them, and they saw the shelves of impossibilities, Dr. Chen sat down hard on the stone floor and just stared. Dr. Webb walked to the shelves of metal ingots and ran his spectrographic analyzer over them, then checked the readout 3 times before speaking. "This is impossible. These alloys shouldn't exist. The combinations, the purity levels, we can't replicate this with modern technology." Dr. Angela Martinez, the anthropologist, was studying the marked tablets with tears running down her face. "This is a complete writing system, fully developed, mathematically precise. We're looking at a civilization we have no record of, no oral tradition of, nothing. It's like they were erased from history." The 4th researcher, Dr. James Okonkwo, a historian specializing in pre-Columbian cultures, approached the crystal map. He studied it for a long time before turning to Mason. "You understand what this means? 17 sites. If even half of them are intact, we're talking about rewriting everything we thought we knew about human development in the Americas." They spent 6 hours in the chamber, documenting everything, taking hundreds of samples, filling notebooks with observations and measurements. When they finally climbed back to the surface, the sun was setting, and they emerged into the cool evening air like divers surfacing from a deep ocean. That night, they sat around a fire outside the cabin, and Dr. Chen laid out the plan. "We need to move fast but carefully. First, we establish legal protection for the site. The non-profit you've created is a good start, but we need federal archaeological preservation status. Second, we need funding for a proper research station, security, preservation equipment. Third, we need to carefully control how this information goes public, a measured release through proper channels, not a media circus." "How long?" Mason asked. 6 months to a year before we can announce anything. We need that time to build proper institutional support to make sure this site can't be seized or looted." She paused. "Can you handle another year of secrecy? Another year of Ashford and people like him pressuring you?" Mason thought about Raymond, who'd handled 30 years of it. "Yeah, I can handle a year." But the universe had other plans. 3 weeks later, Mason woke to the sound of helicopters. Not 1, but 3 circling over the canyon in a coordinated pattern. He rushed outside to see trucks on the trail, maybe half a dozen, all with government plates. His heart sank. Somehow, word had gotten out. A woman in a dark suit climbed out of the lead vehicle and approached the cabin. She held up a badge. "Mr. Carter, I'm Agent Diana Foster, National Park Service, Division of Archaeological Resources. We need to talk." Mason's mouth went dry. "Am I under arrest?" "Should you be?" She smiled slightly. "No, Mr. Carter, you're not under arrest. But someone filed a report claiming you've been removing artifacts from a potentially significant archaeological site. We're required to investigate. I haven't removed anything, Mason said truthfully. Everything is documented and in place. That's what we're here to verify. She gestured to the team behind her. We have a warrant to inspect the property. We can do this cooperatively, or we can do it the hard way. Your choice. Mason made a decision in that moment. I'll cooperate fully, but I need to make one phone call first. 20 minutes later, Dr. Chen arrived with 2 lawyers and enough documentation to prove that the site had been reported to proper authorities, that research was being conducted under appropriate protocols, and that Mason had broken no laws. The National Park Service team spent 2 days examining the vault, and their initial skepticism turned to amazement, turned to grim determination. Mr. Carter, Agent Foster said on the morning of the 3rd day, you're sitting on arguably the most significant archaeological find in North American history. Under normal circumstances, we'd be looking at federal seizure for preservation purposes. But, she held up a hand as Mason started to protest, your legal team has done excellent work. The non-profit structure, the university partnerships, the documentation protocols, you've actually followed proper procedures better than most professional archaeological expeditions. So what happens now? Now we do our jobs. We verify everything, establish federal protection for the site, and work with your foundation to create a research framework. She paused. But make no mistake, this is going public. Within the month, this canyon is going to be flooded with media, researchers, and every treasure hunter within 1,000 miles. You need to be ready for that. Word leaked exactly 12 days later. Not through official channels, but through a graduate student who'd seen some of Dr. Webb's preliminary reports and posted about them on social media. By the time the universities could issue official statements, the story had already gone viral. Ancient civilization discovered in Arizona Canyon. Treasure worth hundreds of millions found by bankrupt contractor. Technology that defies modern science hidden for millennia. Mason's phone, which barely got signal in the canyon, exploded with messages and calls when he drove into town for supplies. News vans were already setting up in Copper Ridge. Reporters were asking questions at the diner, at the hardware store, everywhere. And the looks on the faces of the townspeople who'd mocked him for buying the worthless property, those looks were something Mason would remember forever. Dale Simmons, who'd called him crazy that first day in the hardware store parking lot, approached him outside the post office. Mason, I saw the news. Yeah, it's been a wild few weeks. Dale looked genuinely embarrassed. I owe you an apology. We all do. You weren't crazy. You were the only one smart enough to see what was really there. Mason shook his head. I wasn't smart. I was desperate and lucky. The combination happened to work out. But as the days passed and the full scope of the discovery became public knowledge, Mason realized the truth was more complicated than luck. He'd succeeded where others failed because he'd been willing to look, to question, to trust his instincts even when everyone said he was wrong. Raymond Blackwell had chosen isolation to protect his secret. Mason was choosing transparency, but controlled transparency, revelation on terms that honored what the site represented. The legal battle with Richard Ashford came to a head 2 months after the story broke. Ashford filed claims arguing that his grandfather's 1968 mining rights still applied, that the property had been illegally seized, that Mason's purchase at auction was invalid. His lawyers were good, well-funded, and aggressive. But Mason's team was better. They had public opinion on their side, university support, and most importantly, they had the truth. In a hearing that made national news, the judge ruled that not only were Ashford's claims invalid, but that his family's decades-long surveillance of the property constituted harassment and possible conspiracy. The case was dismissed with prejudice, and Ashford was ordered to pay court costs. Mason stood on the courthouse steps afterward, surrounded by cameras and microphones, and gave his first real public statement. This discovery doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to Richard Ashford or anyone else who wants to profit from it. It belongs to history. It belongs to everyone who's ever wondered what came before us, what we've lost, what truths are still hidden in places we're too afraid to look. My job isn't to own this. It's to protect it so we can all learn from it. The clip played on every news station that night. By morning, Mason Carter was no longer just the lucky contractor who'd found ancient treasure. He was the guardian of something bigger, the voice of responsible archaeology, the example of how to handle discovery with integrity instead of greed. The transformation of Copper Ridge happened faster than anyone expected. Within 6 months of the announcement, the tiny town had 3 new hotels, a dozen restaurants, a visitor center, and a museum dedicated to the ongoing research. The population doubled, property values tripled, jobs appeared where there had been nothing but dust and declining fortunes. And at the center of it all was Mason's foundation, the Blackwell Carter Archaeological Institute, named for the 2 men who'd protected the site across different generations. The institute didn't just study the vault under Mason's property. It coordinated research across all 17 sites marked on the crystal map, creating a network of protected archaeological zones throughout the canyon country. Mason hired locals first, training them as security guards, site managers, research assistants. The kids who'd had no future beyond leaving town were suddenly getting paid to help document history. The woman who'd run the struggling diner now catered meals for research teams. The hardware store owner expanded his inventory to include scientific equipment. The entire economic ecosystem of the region shifted, built on a foundation of discovery and preservation rather than extraction and exploitation. Iris Whitman became the Institute's head of operations, managing the day-to-day logistics while Mason focused on the bigger picture. She'd smiled when he offered her the position. "Took you long enough to ask. I've been preparing for this job since Raymond first told me someone would eventually come." 1 year after the discovery went public, the Institute held its first major conference. Archaeologists, geologists, historians, and scientists from 30 countries gathered in the new research center built at the canyon's edge. Mason stood at the podium in the main auditorium, looking out at hundreds of faces, and felt the weight of what he'd become. "A little over 2 years ago," he began, "I was a failed contractor with $950 to my name and no prospects. Everyone told me buying that canyon property was the dumbest thing I could do. They were probably right by any conventional measure. But sometimes the dumbest decisions turn out to be the most important ones." He clicked through slides showing the vault, the artifacts, the ongoing research. Raymond Blackwell spent 30 years protecting these secrets alone. He died alone, poor, forgotten by everyone except a few people who remembered him as that crazy hermit in the canyon. But he wasn't crazy. He was ahead of his time. He understood that some discoveries are too important to rush, too precious to exploit, too significant to let fall into the wrong hands. The Blackwell Carter Institute exists to honor his vision while avoiding his mistakes. We're not hiding this discovery. We're studying it, sharing it, making sure it benefits everyone. Every artifact we find, every text we translate, every mystery we solve, it all goes into the public domain. No private collections, no secret sales to wealthy individuals. Just truth, available to anyone who wants to learn. The applause was deafening. But what moved Mason most was seeing some of the Copper Ridge locals in the audience. People who'd laughed at him, people who'd warned him away, people who now had jobs and hope because one broke contractor had been too stubborn to listen to common sense. After the conference, Dr. Chen pulled him aside. "You know they're talking about a Nobel Prize, right? For the team that deciphers the writing system. Your name is on the research papers. You could be part of that." Mason shook his head. "I'm not a scientist. I just found it. You're the ones doing the real work." "You're doing something just as important," she insisted. "You're showing the world how to handle discovery responsibly. Do you know how rare that is? Most people who find something this valuable either hide it out of greed or announce it recklessly for fame. You did neither. You built something sustainable, something that will outlast all of us." The personal transformation surprised Mason most of all. He looked in the mirror one morning, 2 years after buying the property, and barely recognized himself. The haunted desperation was gone from his eyes. The defeated slump of his shoulders had straightened into confidence. He'd gained back the weight he'd lost during the divorce, and more importantly, he'd regained something he thought was lost forever. purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was building. Not houses or commercial buildings like he used to, but something bigger. A legacy that would echo through generations. Every decision he made, every policy he established, every researcher he supported, all of it was construction work of a different kind. He was building understanding where there had been ignorance, building protection where there had been vulnerability, building future on the foundation of an impossible past. The discoveries kept coming. The 7th-level chamber under his property turned out to be just the beginning. Other sites in the network yielded different treasures. Astronomical observatories carved into canyon walls, showing knowledge of celestial mechanics that predated European astronomy by centuries. Metallurgical workshops with evidence of techniques modern science was still trying to replicate. Libraries of stone tablets that, once translated, revealed mathematical concepts and philosophical ideas that challenged everything historians thought they knew about ancient America. But the most profound discovery came from Dr. Martinez's anthropological work. By comparing the geometric patterns found across all 17 sites, she'd begun to reconstruct not just what this civilization had made, but how they'd thought. They weren't just technologically advanced, she explained to Mason during one of their weekly meetings. They were philosophically sophisticated in ways we are only beginning to understand. The patterns in their art, their architecture, their writing, it all suggests a worldview based on interconnection and balance. They saw themselves as part of the land, not separate from it. Is that why they disappeared? Mason asked. They understood balance and we don't? Maybe, or maybe they didn't disappear. Maybe they integrated so completely with the landscape that we've been walking past their legacy for centuries without recognizing it. She smiled. Some of the indigenous elders I've spoken with aren't surprised by any of this. They say their stories always told of the ancient ones who came before. We just weren't listening. Mason thought about that often in the quiet hours, sitting on his porch, watching the canyon. The cabin was still his home, though he'd upgraded it significantly. Running water, solar power, internet access, all the modern conveniences. But he'd kept the stone walls, the rustic feel, the sense of connection to Raymond Blackwell and everyone who'd walked this land before. Sometimes, late at night when the research teams had gone home and the canyon was silent except for the wind, Mason would descend into the vault. Not to study or document, just to stand in that golden light and feel the weight of time pressing down from above and rising up from below. In those moments, he understood what Raymond had felt. The responsibility, the wonder, the terrible beauty of being the guardian of something that transcended individual human life. 3 years after the discovery, Mason testified before Congress about archaeological protection laws. 5 years after, he gave a TED Talk that got 40 million views. 7 years after, his foundation was managing over 200 research projects across 3 continents, all focused on discovering and protecting ancient sites before looters or developers could destroy them. But the moment that meant the most to Mason came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in Year 8, when a dusty pickup truck pulled up to the research center and a young woman climbed out. She was maybe 25, with determined eyes and calloused hands. She reminded Mason of himself 8 years earlier. "Mr. Carter," she called out, "I'm Rebecca Torres. I bought a piece of property in New Mexico, old ranch land that everyone said was worthless. But I've been finding things. Stone tools, pottery fragments, markings on canyon walls. I think there might be something significant there, but I don't know what to do. I heard about how you handled your discovery, and I was wondering if maybe you could help me." Mason smiled and gestured toward the research center. "Come on in. Let's see what you've found." As they walked, he thought about the circle of it all. Raymond Blackwell had died alone, his secrets almost lost forever. But he'd left enough clues for Mason to find. And now Mason was doing the same, not hiding the truth, but sharing the methodology, teaching others how to recognize significance, how to protect instead of exploit, how to be guardians instead of owners. The legacy he was building wasn't just about the artifacts in the vault or the research papers documenting ancient civilizations. It was about changing how humanity approached its own past, about fostering curiosity over greed, preservation over profit, understanding over ignorance. On the 10-year anniversary of purchasing the property, the Institute held a celebration at the site. Hundreds of people attended, researchers who'd worked on the project, locals whose lives had been transformed, students studying archaeology because they'd been inspired by the discovery. Even some of the people who'd originally mocked Mason showed up, though their laughter had long since turned to respect. Dale Simmons, now in his 70s, approached Mason near the end of the evening. "You remember what I said that first day, about you throwing away your last $1,000? "I remember. I was wrong about a lot of things in my life, but that might have been the wrongest I've ever been." He shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for being too stubborn to listen to sense." As the sun set over the canyon, painting the rock walls in those familiar shades of orange and gold, Mason stood where he'd stood so many times before. But this time, he wasn't alone. Iris was there, and Dr. Chen, and dozens of researchers and friends and people whose lives had been changed by one desperate decision made a decade ago. "What are you thinking?" Iris asked, walking up beside him. Mason was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking about choices, how the biggest moments in our lives often look like mistakes to everyone watching, how the things that save us are usually the things people warn us away from." "Any regrets?" Only that Raymond couldn't see this, couldn't know that his sacrifice meant something, that his secret would eventually become knowledge instead of staying hidden forever. "He knew," Iris said softly. "Why else would he have left those maps, those journals, all those careful instructions? He knew someone would come. He just had to have faith that whoever came would be worthy of what they found." Mason looked out across the canyon at the research center with its lights blazing, at the paths worn by 10 years of scientists and students, at the community that had grown up around the discovery. From $950 and a prayer to this. From broken contractor to guardian of history. From mockery to meaning. "You know what the real treasure was?" he said finally. "It wasn't the gold or the artifacts or any of that. It was the reminder that the world still has mysteries, that there are still things to discover, still truths hidden in places everyone's too afraid to look." Raymond understood that. That's why he protected it so carefully. He wasn't guarding treasure, he was guarding wonder. The stars were emerging now, thousands of them in the clean desert sky, the same stars the ancient builders of the vaults had watched, the same stars that had guided Raymond through his lonely decades, the same stars that would shine long after Mason and everyone here had become part of history themselves. In the years that followed, Mason continued his work, but with an understanding that the discovery itself was never really the point. The point was what you did with it, how you let it change you. Whether you hoarded it or shared it, exploited it or protected it, let it make you smaller or allowed it to make you vast. He gave talks at universities about courage and persistence, about the value of looking beyond what everyone else sees. He mentored young archaeologists and researchers, teaching them that the greatest discoveries often come from the willingness to be wrong, to be mocked, to be called crazy by people too comfortable to take risks themselves. And sometimes in the quiet of evening, he'd think about that first night in the cabin. The strange sounds, the mysterious visitor asking if he'd found it yet, the weight of not knowing what he'd stepped into. If someone had told him then what the next 10 years would bring, he probably wouldn't have believed it. It was too big, too impossible, too much like a story instead of real life. But that was the thing about real life. It was always stranger and more wonderful than anyone imagined when they were brave enough to reach for it. The people who played it safe, who listened to all the warnings, who bought sensible property in sensible places, they got sensible lives. Nothing wrong with that. But they'd never know what might have been hidden just below the surface, waiting for someone crazy enough to dig. Mason Carter had been that kind of crazy. The broke, desperate, nothing left to lose kind of crazy that sometimes, just sometimes, stumbled into something that changed everything. He'd bought a worthless cabin for pocket change and found a civilization. He'd been mocked by his entire town and silenced them with truth. He'd taken the biggest risk of his life when he had nothing left to lose and discovered he had everything to gain. Anyone can change the world if they're stubborn enough to look where others won't, brave enough to trust what they find, and wise enough to share it when they do. Because sometimes the biggest fortunes hide in the places everyone else is too afraid to look. And sometimes the only thing standing between mockery and legacy is one person with the courage to dig deeper, to question harder, to believe that impossible things are waiting just beneath the surface of everything we think we know. As the desert night settled over the canyon that had become his home, his purpose, his legacy, Mason Carter smiled. They'd laughed when he moved into that cabin, but he'd learned something Raymond Blackwell had understood 30 years before him. The people who laugh the loudest are usually the ones standing too far back to see what's really there. And the people who have the courage to step forward, to ignore the mockery and trust their instincts, those are the people who change history. Not because they're smarter or luckier or more deserving, but because they're willing to be wrong, willing to be called crazy, willing to invest everything in a dream that everyone else calls worthless. That was the real treasure beneath the canyon. Not the gold or the artifacts, but the lesson written in stone and silence. That fortune favors the foolish when the fool has courage enough to see past what everyone else has already decided to ignore. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories of courage, discovery, and triumph against impossible odds are waiting for you. Click now to continue the journey, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the greatest treasures are found by those brave enough to search where others refuse to look.